I was counting down the days until my dream job started. Literally, every morning, I'd wake up and cross out another square on the calendar taped to my fridge. Just 4 days left until I packed up my car and drove across the country to start my new life. After years of grinding, unpaid internships, and eating ramen in a shoebox apartment, I had finally made it. A job at a prestigious design firm in San Francisco, one that came with a salary big enough to put all my financial stress in the rearview mirror. It was supposed to be the happiest week of my life. Instead, my world collapsed in a matter of minutes. It started with a text from my aunt, Marie. "Hey, sweetie, can you come over later? We need to talk." That alone wasn't unusual. Marie and her husband, Uncle Todd, had been like second parents to me ever since my actual parents died in a car accident when I was 17. They took me in, raised me, supported me in ways I could never repay. So when I got the message, I didn't think twice. I just hopped in my car and drove over, assuming they wanted to have one last dinner together before I left. I should have known something was off the moment I stepped inside. The atmosphere was thick, heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Marie was sitting stiffly on the couch, twisting her wedding ring around her finger, while Todd leaned forward, hands clasped together like he was preparing for a funeral. I barely had time to ask what was wrong before Marie blurted it out. "We had to use your relocation fund, honey. I'm so sorry." For a few seconds, I didn't even register the words. "Use? My relocation fund?" I let out a nervous laugh, expecting them to clarify. Maybe they meant they had borrowed a small amount and would pay me back soon. But then Marie's eyes filled with tears, and Todd wouldn't meet my gaze. "All of it," she whispered. "Every cent." My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I felt like I was sinking, like the air had been sucked from the room. "For what?" I finally choked out. Todd sighed and rubbed his forehead. "For Dylan." Dylan, their son, my cousin. The one who had spent his entire adult life chasing one failed business after another, racking up debt, burning through every loan or handout given to him. And now, apparently, he'd taken everything I had. "We didn't have a choice," Marie continued, her voice trembling. "The bank was going to foreclose on his gaming lounge. He was going to lose everything." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So you let me lose everything instead?" My voice cracked, and I hated how weak I sounded. Todd sat up straighter, his jaw tightening. "Don't be dramatic. It's not like you don't have a job lined up. You'll be fine." "Fine?" I had prepaid my security deposit, my first month's rent, even some non-refundable moving expenses. I had meticulously planned every dollar in that fund to ensure I had a stable start in a new city. Now, I had nothing, and they thought I'd be fine? Marie reached for my hand, but I jerked away. "We're family," she pleaded. "You wouldn't let your cousin end up on the street, would you?" Something inside me snapped. "No, but apparently you had no problem doing that to me." The silence that followed was deafening. For years, I had trusted them, believed they had my best interests at heart. But they had emptied the account I had spent years saving, without even telling me, without even asking. I stood up so fast that the coffee table wobbled. "I want it back," I said, my voice shaking. "Every cent." Marie let out a strangled sob. "We don't have it, sweetheart." Todd, ever the pragmatist, exhaled sharply. "Even if we did, we wouldn't just hand it back to you. Dylan is family, too. He needed it more than you." I could feel my hands trembling. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to rewind time and never step foot in this house. But instead, I turned on my heel and walked out the door. Because I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't family to them. Not anymore. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My chest felt like it was caving in, my mind replaying their words over and over. Every cent gone. They had taken it, spent it, and acted like I was the selfish one for being angry about it. The betrayal sat heavy in my stomach, twisting into something sharp, something I wasn't sure I could swallow. When I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, I barely remembered the drive. My hands shook as I climbed the stairs to my unit, and the second I was inside, I locked the door, pressed my back against it, and exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and for a second, I considered ignoring it, But when I pulled it out, I saw a message from Dylan. "Hey man, sorry you had to find out like that. I swear I'll pay you back when the lounge takes off. Hope no hard feelings." I stared at the screen, the audacity of it making my blood boil. No apology. No acknowledgement of what he'd done. Just the assumption that I would accept it, that I would understand, that I would be okay with my future being sacrificed for yet another one of his doomed ventures. I wanted to throw my phone across the room, but instead, I forced myself to type a response, my fingers tight with fury. "You stole from me. You and your parents. I don't care what happens to your lounge. I want my money back." The message sent, and I barely had time to process before another one popped up. "Dude, chill. It's not like you're homeless. You'll be fine. I needed it more than you." Something in me snapped, a cold realization settling into my bones. They had convinced themselves that I didn't matter, that my struggle was less real than Dylan's, that I could take the hit because I was responsible, because I had always been the one to figure things out on my own. They had decided for me that my sacrifices were worth less, and that I couldn't forgive. I spent the next hour combing through my finances, hoping, praying that maybe I had enough left to scrape something together. But the truth was brutal. My entire relocation plan had been built around that fund, and without it, I was screwed. The lease in San Francisco was already in my name. The moving company had been paid. My resignation at my current job had already been finalized. I had put everything into this move, trusting that the money I had worked for would be there. And now, I was left with barely enough to survive the next 2 weeks. The next morning, I called the moving company, hoping I could at least get a partial refund. The woman on the other end was polite but firm. Cancellations at this stage were non-refundable. I hung up, staring blankly at the wall, my mind spinning through every possible solution. Borrow money? No. Ask my friends for help? Maybe, but the thought of explaining what had happened made my stomach churn. Take out a loan? Even if I could, it wouldn't come in time. As I sat there, my phone rang again. Marie. I let it ring until it went to voicemail, but then another call came through. Todd. Then Dylan. Then Marie again. Finally, I picked up, my voice cold and flat. What? Marie's voice was thick with fake concern. Sweetheart, we need to talk. We already did. A long pause. Then, listen, I know you're upset, but this isn't fair to Dylan. He's under so much stress, and you making this a big deal isn't helping. I closed my eyes, inhaling sharply. I don't give a damn about Dylan's stress. I give a damn about the fact that you stole from me. You ruined my plans. Do you even get that? Marie sighed, like she was exhausted, like she was the victim here. You're young, you'll bounce back. Dylan. I hung up. For the rest of the day, I tried to think of a way out. I called my bank to see if there was anything they could do, but since the withdrawals had been made legally by Marie and Todd, who had access to the account years ago when they were technically my guardians, there was no recourse. I looked into taking legal action, but the lawyer I consulted basically told me I'd spend more in fees than I'd probably recover. By the time the sun set, I was out of options. And then, as if the universe wanted to drive the knife in deeper, my landlord called. Hey, just checking in. Saw the notice you were moving out this week. Everything on track? I hesitated, my mouth suddenly dry. Yeah, everything's fine. A lie, one that settled into my chest like a weight. I had 48 hours to figure out where to go, because I couldn't stay here, and I had no way to get there. And the people who were supposed to have my back had left me to drown. I didn't sleep. I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, running the same thoughts in circles until my head ached. I had 48 hours to either make it to San Francisco or accept that I was about to lose my job before it even started. The worst part was knowing that Marie, Todd, and Dylan were probably sleeping just fine, convinced that I'd get over it, that I'd find a way to make things work like I always had. They weren't losing any sleep over the fact that they had left me stranded, so why should they care? My phone was still lighting up with texts I refused to answer, all variations of the same message. You need to stop being so dramatic, you'll figure it out, and my favorite, from Dylan himself, we're family, don't be petty. I wanted to scream, but instead, I forced myself to get out of bed and start looking for solutions, even if it felt hopeless. Around noon, I went to the coffee shop down the street. desperate for a change of scenery, my laptop open as I scoured last-minute flights, bus tickets, anything that might give me a shot at getting to California. Nothing was within reach. Even the cheapest flights were too expensive, and I couldn't justify spending money I didn't have on a bus ticket that would take days to get there. I was running out of time, and the weight of it all was pressing down so hard I could barely think straight. I was about to shut my laptop and go back to my apartment to figure out my next move when someone sat down across from me. I looked up, already irritated, only to freeze when I saw who it was. Jake. We hadn't spoken in over a year, not since he moved to Seattle for work, but there he was, sitting across from me like we'd just seen each other yesterday. I didn't even know he was back in town. "Hey," he said, setting his coffee down and eyeing me like he already knew something was wrong. "You look like you want to throw your laptop across the room." I let out a short, humorless laugh, rubbing a hand over my face. "Yeah, something like that." Jake leaned back, taking a sip of his drink before nodding toward my screen. "What's going on?" For a second, I thought about brushing it off, pretending everything was fine, but then the exhaustion hit me all at once. What was the point? I had nothing to lose. So I told him. Everything. How I had spent years saving for this move. How Marie and Todd had taken every cent without telling me. How Dylan had the nerve to act like I was the one being unreasonable. I expected some kind of shock or outrage, maybe even pity, but Jake just listened, letting me get it all out without interrupting. When I finally stopped, feeling drained and frustrated all over again, he set his cup down and sighed. "Wow, that's messed up." That's one way to put it. I exhaled sharply, closing my laptop. "Anyway, I'll figure something out." Jake didn't say anything for a moment, just watching me like he was working something out in his head. Then, before I could even react, he pulled out his phone and started typing. "What are you doing?" I asked, suddenly on edge. "Seeing if there's a way to get you to San Francisco." I frowned. "Jake, I appreciate it, but I can't." "Relax, I'm not offering to buy you a ticket." He smirked. "I'm offering you a ride." I blinked at him, not sure I had heard him right. "A ride?" "Yeah. I drove down from Seattle a few days ago to visit my folks. I was supposed to head back tomorrow, but I can push it up a day. It's not like San Francisco is that far out of the way." For a moment, I just stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. It almost seemed too good to be true. "You're serious?" Jake shrugged. "I mean, unless you'd rather stay here and wait for Dylan to miraculously pay you back." That was all it took. I nodded before I could second-guess myself. "Okay. Yeah. Let's do it." Jake grinned. "Cool. Pack your stuff. We leave first thing in the morning." For the first time in days, I felt something close to relief. I wasn't out of the woods yet, but at least now, I had a chance. And I wasn't going to waste it. Packing felt different this time. Before, when I had carefully planned everything down to the smallest detail, it had been exciting. Now, it just felt rushed, messy, like I was trying to salvage a disaster I had no control over. I shoved clothes into my duffel, trying not to think about the fact that I wasn't packing the way I wanted to, that I had been forced into this situation by people I had trusted. Every time I caught a glimpse of my phone screen lighting up with another call from Marie or Todd, the anger surged again, but I ignored them. There was nothing left to say. By the time Jake showed up early the next morning, my bags were waiting by the door. He didn't say much, just helped me load everything into the trunk of his car before sliding into the driver's seat. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy, like he knew I wasn't ready to talk yet. We pulled out of the parking lot, leaving behind the life I had built, the place I had thought I would be leaving on my own terms. The highway stretched ahead, and I told myself that as long as I made it to San Francisco, none of this would matter anymore. A few hours into the drive, Jake finally spoke. "You gonna tell them you made it?" I didn't look away from the window. "I don't owe them that." He nodded like he understood, which he probably did. We had been friends long enough for him to know my history with my aunt and uncle, the way they had always treated me like an afterthought while Dylan could do no wrong. But even he seemed shocked that they had taken it this far. "They're still calling?" he asked after a while. "Yeah." I glanced at my phone again. This time, it was Dylan. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. I don't know why they think I'd want to hear from them. Jake exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening on the wheel. Because they don't think they did anything wrong. That was the worst part. The absolute certainty that they still saw themselves as the victims in this. That they were probably sitting around wondering why I was being so difficult, why I couldn't just let it go and move on like I always had. I clenched my jaw, trying to push the thought away, but it sat there, heavy and bitter. Jake didn't say anything else for a while, just kept driving, the hum of the road the only sound between us. I tried to focus on the fact that I was getting out, that I had a chance to start over, but the anger was still there, burning under the surface. We stopped for gas in some nowhere town, and while Jake filled up the tank, I checked my messages out of morbid curiosity. There were more missed calls, more texts, but one stood out. It wasn't from Marie or Todd. It was from Dylan. Dude, you seriously need to call me. It's bad. I stared at it for a long time, debating whether I even cared. But something about the wording nagged at me. Not defensive, not dismissive, just urgent. Against my better judgment, I called him back. He picked up on the first ring. Finally. Where the hell are you? I ignored that. What do you want? There was a long pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was different. Not cocky, not careless, just panicked. I screwed up. I didn't say anything. Waiting. The lounge. It's done. His breathing was uneven, like he was pacing. The investors pulled out. The bank's coming after everything. It's over. I should have felt satisfaction, maybe even vindication, but all I felt was exhaustion. And this is my problem, how? You don't get it, Dylan said quickly. Mom and Dad put their house up as collateral. If I lose this place, they lose everything. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I gripped the phone tighter. What the hell are you talking about? They lied, he said, his voice almost frantic now. They didn't just take your money. They took out loans against the house. They bet everything on me turning this around. I stood there, processing that, the weight of it making my head spin. They hadn't just destroyed my future. They had destroyed their own, and now, when everything was crashing down around them, they thought I would come running to save them. Jake walked back over, raising an eyebrow when he saw my face. What? I shook my head, turning away slightly. You're telling me this why? I asked Dylan. Because you have to talk to them, he said, desperation creeping into his voice. They won't listen to me. They're freaking out. They think you're gonna do something crazy, like sue or... I laughed, and it was sharp, humorless. You think I care what happens to them after what they did to me? You don't get it, Dylan snapped. They'll lose everything. They'll have nothing. I swallowed, my grip tightening on the phone. And Dylan went quiet. For the first time, I realized he had always assumed there was a line I wouldn't cross, that no matter how badly they treated me, I would never actually let them fall. But that line didn't exist anymore. I exhaled slowly. That's not my problem. Dylan's breath hitched, like he hadn't really believed I would say it. Come on, man. I hung up. Jake watched me carefully as I shoved my phone back into my pocket. That bad? Worse. I looked at him, then back at the open road ahead. Let's just go. He didn't ask any more questions. He just got back in the car, started the engine, and pulled onto the highway. And I didn't look back. The drive to San Francisco felt different after that call. Before, there had been tension, frustration, a sense of urgency to fix what had been broken. Now, there was just silence. Not the kind that needed to be filled, not awkward or heavy, just final. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the road, knowing that somewhere back home, Marie and Todd were panicking, realizing the walls were caving in. Dylan was probably trying to come up with some last-minute scheme, some ridiculous plan to salvage himself at the expense of everyone else. But this time, there was no more safety net. They had counted on me to be the fallback. They had assumed I would cave, that I would step in and help them pick up the pieces like I always had, but I wasn't that person anymore. Jake must have sensed it, because he didn't press me to talk. He just kept driving, letting the miles add up between me and the mess I had left behind. Every so often, he'd glance over, like he was checking to make sure I wasn't going to change my mind, but I just sat there, my phone buzzing in my pocket, unread messages piling up. I didn't even need to look at them to know what they said. Desperate pleas, guilt trips, maybe even threats. But none of it mattered anymore. They had made their choice. Now, they had to live with it. We got to San Francisco late in the evening, the city lights stretching out ahead as we pulled onto the street where my new apartment was waiting. It should have felt like a victory, like a fresh start, but all I felt was exhaustion. Jake parked the car, cutting the engine before turning to me. "You good?" I let out a slow breath, nodding. "Yeah." He didn't look convinced. "You sure?" I wasn't. Not really, but I wasn't going to say that. So I just forced a small smirk. "You sticking around? Or was this just a one-way trip?" Jake grinned, shaking his head. "I'll crash for the night, but I've got to get back to Seattle tomorrow. Think you'll survive?" I nodded again, and for the first time in days, it didn't feel like a lie. We grabbed my bags from the trunk, carrying them up to the apartment. It was still mostly empty, just the bare essentials I had arranged to be delivered ahead of time. But it was mine, a place untouched by the past, by their mistakes, by their expectations. I stood in the doorway, taking it in, feeling the weight of everything I had gone through settle in my chest. Jake clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You did it." I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. "Barely. But you did." He wasn't wrong. They had tried to ruin me, to take away everything I had worked for, and yet, here I was. Maybe I wasn't standing the way I had planned. Maybe I had gotten here bruised and battered, but I had still made it. That had to count for something. Jake crashed on the couch that night, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I actually slept. No tossing and turning, no waking up in a panic, just rest. When morning came, I walked him out to his car, the city already buzzing around us. He tossed his bag into the passenger seat before turning back to me. "If they try to pull anything, call me," he said. "Seriously, don't try to deal with them alone." I nodded. "Thanks, man. For everything." He smirked. "Don't make it weird." I rolled my eyes, and just like that, he was gone, pulling back onto the road, heading north. I watched until his car disappeared, then turned back toward the apartment. My phone was still buzzing. I finally pulled it out, scrolling through the unread messages. Dylan had sent more, each more desperate than the last. "They're going to lose the house. You can't just ignore us. You're really going to let them suffer?" Marie and Todd had both sent messages too. At first, it was guilt-tripping, trying to appeal to whatever sense of obligation they thought I still had. Then came the anger. Accusations. How could I be so heartless? How could I do this to my own family? I read each one carefully, feeling nothing. Then, finally, one last message from Marie. "We never should have taken you in." I stared at it for a long time, letting it sink in. That was it, then. The truth laid bare. It had never really been about family. Not to them. They had taken me in because they had seen it as their responsibility, but they had never seen me as one of their own. Not like they had with Dylan. And the second I stopped being useful, the second I stopped playing my role, they had no problem cutting me loose. I deleted the messages. Then, without hesitation, I blocked all three of them. When I walked back into my apartment, it was quiet, still. My new life was waiting, and for the first time in a long time, I was finally ready to live it.